The alien captain stared at the being standing defiantly in the center of the charred battlefield. A human. Shorter and more fragile-looking than the Vrihan warriors who now encircled him, their elongated limbs and scaled bodies gleaming under the twin moons of Dirax 9. The human's armor was rudimentary compared to the advanced tech of the Vrihan, a patchwork of metal plates, singed fabric, and something the captain could only describe as reckless determination. It didn't make sense. The human had been isolated from the rest of his squad, left behind as their forces retreated across the scarred plains. Yet here he stood, alone, a smirk tugging at the edges of his dirt-streaked face. "Does he think we will let him live?" muttered Varkesh, the captain's second-in-command, his voice carrying the guttural timbre of the Vrihan language. Captain Krentok didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was clear: the human's fate was sealed. No one defied the might of the Vrihan and lived to tell the tale. The captain raised his hand, signaling the warriors to close in. Their weapons, sleek, crystalline rifles capable of disintegrating flesh on contact, were already trained on the human. "Human," Krentok called out, his voice amplified by his helm. "This is your final chance to surrender. Throw down your weapon, kneel, and perhaps you will be shown mercy." The human cocked his head, his smirk widening. He raised his rifle, a primitive projectile weapon by Vrihan standards, and rested it casually on his shoulder. "Mercy?" he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "You think I need mercy?" Krentok's mandibles clicked in irritation. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Do not mistake our patience for weakness." The human laughed, a sharp, almost reckless sound that echoed across the battlefield. "You don't get it, do you?" the human said, his tone laced with defiance. "You think you're the hunters, but you've just cornered the wrong animal." Before Krentok could respond, the human moved. It happened in an instant, a blur of motion as he dove to the side, his rifle snapping up with deadly precision. A shot rang out, and one of the Vrihan warriors collapsed, a smoking hole punched cleanly through his chest. "Fire!" Krentok bellowed. The battlefield erupted into chaos. The Vrihan warriors unleashed a volley of plasma bolts, their weapons lighting up the night like a storm of neon fire. But the human was already on the move, weaving through the chaos with uncanny speed. He returned fire, his weapon barking with each shot. Despite the outdated technology, every bullet found its mark. Warriors fell one after another, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the human carved a path through their ranks. Krentok watched in stunned disbelief. This wasn't possible. No human should have been able to react this quickly, to outmaneuver trained Vrihan soldiers. And yet, here he was, a blur of motion, his laughter cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Surround him!" Varkesh roared, his voice desperate. The warriors closed in, forming a tight circle around the human. Plasma bolts rained down, forcing him into cover behind a smoldering wreck. The Vrihan advanced cautiously, their weapons trained on the wreckage. "Nowhere left to run, human," Krentok said, his voice laced with cold triumph. For a moment there was silence. Then the human's voice rang out, clear and mocking. "Run? I'm just getting started." The wreckage exploded outward as the human emerged, a grenade in each hand. He hurled them into the crowd of warriors, the concussive blast sending bodies flying in every direction. Before the smoke cleared, he was on them, his rifle barking as he charged forward. The Vrihan warriors faltered. This wasn't a soldier. This was a force of nature. Krentok snarled, raising his own weapon. He wouldn't allow this insult to stand. With practiced precision he fired, the plasma bolt streaking toward the human. It hit him square in the chest. The human staggered, his body jerking as the plasma dissipated against his armor. For a brief moment, Krentok felt a surge of satisfaction. No one survived a direct hit from a Vrihan weapon. And then the human laughed. It was a deep, guttural sound, filled with a kind of primal joy. He straightened, brushing ash from his chest plate, and looked directly at Krentok. "That tickled," he said, grinning like a madman. Krentok's blood ran cold. "What are you?" The human's grin widened. "I'm just a guy who doesn't know when to quit." With a roar, the human surged forward, closing the distance between himself and the Vrihan captain. Krentok fired again and again, each shot hitting its mark, but it didn't matter. The human kept coming, his laughter growing louder with each step. "Fall back!" Varkesh shouted, panic seeping into his voice. But it was too late. The human reached Krentok, slamming into him with the force of a charging predator. The Vrihan captain barely had time to react before he was on the ground, the human's boot pressing against his chest. "You came to our planet," the human said, his voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could scare us, break us. But here's the thing about humans, you can knock us down but we always get back up. Krentok struggled, his strength no match for the humans' unyielding grip. Around them, the remaining Vrihan warriors hesitated, their weapons trembling in their hands. Go ahead, the human said, his eyes locking onto the soldiers. Shoot me again. Let's see what happens. None of them moved. Thought so, he said, his smirk returning. He stepped back, letting Krentok rise to his feet. The Vrihan captain glared at him, his pride burning hotter than his fear. This isn't over, human, Krentok snarled. The human tilted his head. Oh, I know. It's just getting fun. As the Vrihan retreated into the shadows, the human stood alone on the battlefield, his laughter echoing into the night. The Vrihan forces regrouped just beyond the battlefield, their movements shadowed by the dying embers of the skirmish. Captain Krentok paced before his warriors, his mandibles clicking in frustration. Around him, the wounded groaned, plasma burns searing their scales. This was supposed to have been a routine operation. Mop up the scattered human resistance, secure the resource-rich sector of Dirax 9, and move on to the next. But this human, this impossible creature, had turned their precision assault into a nightmare. He's not invincible, Varkesh said, his voice tinged with frustration, though his eyes betrayed unease. We've seen his armor dent, his steps falter. He bleeds just as we do. Then why isn't he dead? Krentok snarled, slamming a clawed hand onto the tactical table before him. A holographic display flickered with the map of their current position, the smoldering battlefield at its center. We hit him with plasma. Point blank. No one survives that. Varkesh hesitated. Perhaps, the humans have found some new technology. Reinforcements, augmentations. Don't be a fool, Krentok snapped. Their technology is centuries behind ours. They still use projectiles and combustion engines. That human was? He cut himself off, refusing to say what they were all thinking. That the human was something else. A soft chime interrupted them, signaling an incoming transmission. Krentok turned to the communicator, his claws twitching with irritation. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to General Tharuk, his superior back on the command vessel orbiting Dirax 9. Krentok, Tharuk began, his voice a low rumble of authority. Reports from your sector are concerning. Is it true that a single human forced your forces into retreat? Krentok stiffened, his pride bristling. It was a tactical withdrawal, General. The human displayed unexpected capabilities. We are regrouping to neutralize him. Tharuk's eyes narrowed. Unexpected capabilities? A single human? This is unacceptable. I'm dispatching reinforcements to your location. Handle this quickly, Captain, or I'll find someone who will. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Krentok simmering with rage. He turned back to his warriors, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. We end this now, he growled. Deploy the shock troopers. Bring the heavy artillery. I want that human obliterated. The human stood atop a jagged outcropping, his gaze fixed on the distant lights of the Vrihan encampment. The wind whipped around him, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal. His rifle rested at his side, and though his body ached from the earlier battle, his spirit burned with unyielding fire. They'll come back, he muttered to himself, running a hand across the scorched chest plate of his armor. The plasma bolts had left their mark, but he was still standing. Still fighting. Reaching into a pouch on his belt, he pulled out a small photograph, its edges worn from years of handling. It showed a smiling woman and a young girl, their faces framed by a backdrop of Earth's blue skies. His family. I'm not done yet, he whispered, tucking the photo back into his armor. A distant rumble broke the silence, the ground trembling beneath his feet. He looked up to see a swarm of Vrihan craft cutting across the sky, their engines glowing with an ominous red hue. Behind them marched a line of mechanized walkers, their towering frames bristling with weaponry. The Vrihan weren't holding back this time. All right, the human said, hefting his rifle. Let's see what you've got. The assault began with a deafening roar as the Vrihan forces unleashed their full might. Plasma beams carved through the air, reducing the jagged terrain to molten slag. The walkers advanced steadily, their cannons firing in synchronized bursts. The smaller drones swarmed ahead, seeking to overwhelm their target with sheer numbers. But the human didn't run. Instead, he darted into the chaos, using the uneven terrain to his advantage. Plasma bolts scorched the ground where he had stood moments earlier, but he was already moving, his rifle spitting fire at the oncoming drones. One after another, the drones fell, their sleek frames crumpling under the relentless barrage. When his rifle clicked empty, he didn't hesitate. He switched to a sidearm, taking down 2 more drones before diving into cover. The walkers shifted their focus, their cannons locking onto his position. The human grabbed a discarded grenade from the ground, hurling it with deadly accuracy. The explosion rocked one of the walkers, its left leg buckling under the force. "Is that all you've got?" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. The Vrihan forces faltered, their advance slowing. The human was supposed to be a cornered animal, yet he fought like a predator. Every step they took was met with resistance, every attack countered with impossible precision. In the command vehicle, Krentok watched the battle unfold, his frustration growing with every passing second. "He's toying with us," Varkesh muttered, his tone grim. "No," Krentok said, his eyes narrowing. "He's buying time." "Time for what?" Krentok's claws dug into the armrest of his seat. "To make us bleed. To break our spirit. That's what humans do, they endure no matter the cost." Outside, the human continued his assault, his movements growing more desperate as the Vrihan pressed forward. He was running out of ammunition, his armor cracked and scorched. Yet he fought on, his laughter ringing through the battlefield like a challenge. Krentok had had enough. "Activate the orbital strike," he ordered. Varkesh's eyes widened. "The orbital strike? But Captain, that will—" "I don't care," Krentok snapped. "I want him dead." Above Dirax 9, the Vrihan command vessel adjusted its position, aligning its massive cannon with the battlefield below. The weapon, a relic of their empire's heyday, was capable of leveling entire cities in a single blast. The human spotted the glint of light in the sky, his smirk fading. He knew what was coming. "This is gonna hurt," he muttered, pulling the photograph from his armor one last time. He pressed it to his lips, a silent promise escaping his breath. The cannon fired. A beam of searing light lanced through the atmosphere, striking the battlefield with apocalyptic force. The ground buckled, a shockwave ripping through the air and consuming everything in its path. The Vrihan forces were thrown back, their ranks decimated by their own weapon. When the dust settled, the battlefield was unrecognizable, a smoking crater where life had once stood. Krentok stepped out of the command vehicle, surveying the destruction. His mandibles twitched with satisfaction. "It's done," he said, his voice heavy with finality. But as the wind carried the ash across the desolate plain, a figure emerged from the smoke. Krentok froze, his blood turning to ice. The human was still standing. The sight was impossible. Captain Krentok blinked, his vision struggling to make sense of the figure emerging from the smoke and ash. The orbital strike had left a crater the size of a small city, the heat still rippling off the ground. Trees had been vaporized, rock turned to glass. Nothing should have survived, not even the hardiest of creatures. And yet there he was. The human limped forward, his armor scorched black, his rifle nowhere to be seen. His right arm hung limply at his side, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. But the look in his eyes, those defiant, burning eyes, made Krentok take an involuntary step back. "Are you kidding me?" the human muttered, his voice hoarse but laced with that same unshakable amusement. He coughed, spitting blood onto the ground, then straightened as much as his battered body would allow. "That's your big move? An orbital strike? I was expecting something. I don't know, clever." Krentok's mandibles clicked nervously. Around him, the remaining Vrihan warriors were frozen, their weapons slack in their hands. The human shouldn't be alive, but the evidence stood right in front of them, defying logic, reason, and fear. "Kill him?" Krentok roared, his voice breaking through the paralysis gripping his soldiers. "I don't care what it takes, end him now." The warriors snapped into action, raising their weapons and unleashing a hail of plasma fire. The human stumbled forward, his steps uneven but unwavering. He ducked and weaved, using the shattered landscape to his advantage. He picked up a shard of twisted metal and hurled it with surprising strength, impaling one of the warriors through the chest. He didn't need a rifle anymore. The human moved like a force of nature, a whirlwind of fury and desperation. He closed the distance between himself and the Vrihan, his fists slamming into armor and flesh with bone-crunching force. Every time he should have fallen, he found a way to rise. Krentok watched in disbelief as his warriors fell, one by one, to this battered, bleeding creature. It was more than skill or strength, it was something deeper, something primal. "Varkesh," Krentok whispered, his voice trembling. "What is he? How does he keep going?" Varkesh, standing at his side, hesitated before answering. "I've heard stories about humans. They call it willpower. They say it's what makes them dangerous. They don't know how to give up. That's not willpower, Krentok snapped. That's madness. Perhaps they're the same thing, Varkesh replied grimly. The human's breath came in ragged gasps as he stood over the last of the Vrihan warriors, his body swaying like a tree in a storm. Blood dripped from his knuckles, staining the ground beneath him. That all you got? He called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Krentok clenched his fists, his pride and fury warring with the icy tendrils of fear creeping up his spine. He couldn't let this human win, not after everything. Deploy the nullifier, Krentok ordered. Varkesh hesitated. Captain, the nullifier hasn't been tested. If it malfunctions, I don't care. Krentok bellowed. Activate it. The nullifier was a last resort weapon, a device designed to disrupt the very fabric of biological and mechanical systems within a defined radius. It didn't discriminate, anything caught in its field would be reduced to molecular chaos. A sleek, cylindrical drone emerged from the command vehicle, its surface glowing with a pulsating blue light. It hovered toward the human, its energy field expanding as it approached. The human paused, his gaze locking onto the device. His lips curled into a faint smile. Oh, that's cute, he said, his voice dry with exhaustion. The nullifier's field reached him, its energy crackling as it began to envelop his body. For a moment, he staggered, his movements slowing as the device's effects took hold. Krentok allowed himself a moment of relief. Finally, the human would fall. But then the human did something unexpected. He roared. It was a sound unlike anything the Vrihan had ever heard, a primal guttural cry that seemed to shake the very air around them. The human reached out, grabbing the nullifier with both hands, and with a surge of strength that defied all reason, he tore the device in half. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield, throwing Krentok and his remaining soldiers to the ground. When the dust settled, the human was still standing. Barely. Krentok rose to his feet, his body trembling with a mix of fury and dread. This wasn't just a battle anymore, it was an affront to everything he understood about the universe. You're not a soldier, Krentok said, his voice wavering. You're a monster. The human chuckled, his laughter soft but filled with an undeniable edge. Monster? Nah. I'm just a guy with a lot to fight for. He took a step forward and Krentok instinctively retreated. You came to our world, the human continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. You thought you could take what you wanted. That we'd just roll over and let you win. Another step. But here's the thing about humans, you can't break us. No matter what you throw at us, no matter how hard you hit, we'll get back up. Every damn time. Krentok stumbled, his pride crumbling under the weight of the human's words. Around him, the surviving Vrihan warriors dropped their weapons, their fear overwhelming their loyalty. This is your only warning, the human said, his eyes locking onto Krentok's. Get off our planet. Go back to wherever you came from. And tell your people, if you ever come back, we won't just fight you. We'll end you. Krentok said nothing. He couldn't. The human turned away, his steps unsteady but purposeful. He didn't look back as the Vrihan forces began their retreat, their pride and ambition reduced to ashes. Krentok sat alone in the command vehicle, the hum of its systems barely audible over the pounding in his skull. Around him, his warriors slumped in silence, their gazes fixed on the ground. None dared to meet his eyes. The shame was palpable, a poison seeping into the very fabric of the Vrihan forces. The human had won. Even as Krentok tried to rationalize it, his mandibles clenched with frustration. The might of the Vrihan Empire had been broken, not by an army, but by a single battered human who refused to die. That defiance had shaken them to their core. He activated the comms console, hesitating for only a moment before opening a channel to General Thurok. The general's face appeared on the screen, his expression hard and unforgiving. Report, Thurok demanded. Krentok hesitated, his pride warring with the truth. The operation has failed, General. Thurok's mandibles flared in anger. Failed? Oh. You had overwhelming firepower. You had the nullifier. Krentok's claws tapped nervously against the console. It wasn't enough. The human, he's unlike anything we've faced before. Our weapons, our tactics, they couldn't stop him. You're telling me, Thurok growled, that one human defeated an entire battalion of Vrihan warriors? Do you realize how pathetic that sounds? Krentok's mandibles twitched. It's not just strength, General. It's something else. Something we don't understand. Humans, they don't fight like we do. They don't fight for conquest or glory. They fight for their people, their home. And they don't stop, no matter the cost. Tharuk leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing. So, you're saying they're a threat? Krentok swallowed hard. Yes, General. A significant one. The screen went dark, leaving Krentok alone with his thoughts. The retreat order was given moments later. The human, battered and bloodied, sat on a ridge overlooking the battlefield. The Vrihan forces were pulling back, their ships lifting off and disappearing into the sky one by one. He watched them go, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He'd won. But the victory felt hollow. Reaching into his armor, he pulled out the photograph of his family. He stared at their smiling faces, his thumb brushing over the edges of the worn paper. I did it, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I kept my promise. A soft breeze carried the scent of smoke and scorched earth. The battlefield was quiet now, the silence almost deafening. The human closed his eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Footsteps approached from behind and he tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. It's just me, a voice said, calm and familiar. He turned to see Corporal Jenks, another survivor of the Vrihan invasion. She looked as battered as he felt, her armor cracked and covered in dirt. But her expression was one of cautious relief. They're leaving, Jenks said, sitting down beside him. You did it? The human nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yeah. For now. Jenks frowned. You think they'll come back? They will, he said without hesitation. But next time they'll bring more. Bigger weapons, better strategies. They won't make the same mistakes. Jenks sighed, her shoulders slumping. So what do we do? The human smiled faintly, the fire in his eyes still burning despite his exhaustion. We get ready. We make sure that when they come back they find out the hard way why humans don't quit. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow but deliberate. Jenks followed, her resolve hardening at the determination in his voice. Come on, he said. We've got work to do. Months later, deep in the Vrihan capital, General Tharuk stood before the High Council, his mandibles clicking nervously as he delivered his report. The council chamber was massive, its walls adorned with holographic displays of the Empire's conquests. But today the images felt hollow. The humans, Tharuk began, his voice measured, are more resilient than we anticipated. Their technology is primitive, but their willpower, it's unparalleled. One of them, just one, held an entire battalion at bay. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. Tharuk continued. If we invade again, we'll need to commit overwhelming resources. Anything less will result in another failure. A silence settled over the chamber, heavy and foreboding. Finally, the council leader spoke, his voice cold and calculating. Perhaps, he said, it is not the humans who need to change. Perhaps it is us. If they will not submit, we must ensure they cannot rise. Tharuk hesitated. You mean? Yes, the council leader said, his eyes narrowing. Extermination. The human race must be eliminated before they become a true threat to the Empire. Tharuk bowed his head, his stomach twisting with unease. He knew the council's decision was final. On Earth, preparations were already underway. The human resistance had spread across the globe, uniting under a single banner for the first time in centuries. They worked tirelessly, turning the ruins of their cities into fortresses, their primitive technology into something greater. The man who had stood against the Vrihan invasion, now a symbol of hope and defiance, walked among them, his presence inspiring those who had once felt hopeless. He knew the Vrihan would return. He also knew that this time humanity wouldn't face them as scattered survivors. They would face them as warriors. And when the day came, the Vrihan would learn a lesson etched into the very soul of the human race. You can't break us. You can't stop us. And no matter how hard you try, we'll keep coming.